Okay, let's get going. Good evening and welcome to all our management competency students in class tonight and all of those through the week who are going to be watching this session. I'm very excited tonight to be able to introduce our guest speaker. And we often talk to you about how we have to think about practice and how the theories, how they work in practice, how they unfold in this crazy, interesting world that we call organizations. So tonight we have Rebecca coming to talk to us, and I'll just give a little bit of an intro, then Rebecca's going to give us a presentation, and there will be time for questions. So think about what questions you might want to ask of somebody who's had to grapple with the theories that you're thinking about and how to actually implement them in real life situations. So just to introduce Rebecca briefly, in terms of where she started, it's interesting to think that she started in a very similar place to most of you. So with a business degree from Monash is where she started out. She had a very fast-moving career, which includes some of the big names in terms of the Australian landscape and indeed the international landscape. So we think about McDonald's, Lion Nathan, Barbecues Galore, to name but a few. In terms of one of the most recent roles that Rebecca held was with Kraft Foods Cadbury's, and that was a president of AP Developed Markets. I think Rebecca's going to tell you a little bit about this role, but in this role, just to put it in context, she oversaw the integration of two massive organizations and was responsible for 1.7 billion in annual sales and just under 4,000 employees. So a massive organization in terms of the undertaking. Unsurprisingly, in 2013, Rebecca was named one of Australia's most influential women at the Westpac AFR Women of Influence Awards. I dug up this little comment today that I would love to share with you that comes from one of Rebecca's colleagues who's worked with her. And this particular colleague has said she always stood out as someone who was driven to make things happen, was relentless in getting the job done. So we think about that strong focus that Rebecca has brought to her work. But it has been tempered. Rebecca lives in Melbourne with her husband and her 2 children. She's a practicing Buddhist. So I'm sure Rebecca's had a lot of those challenges in terms of the work-life balance that we've spoken about, of stress management, of how to balance between the work demands, the home demands, other demands. So I'm sure there might be some questions around that. So I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to leave it up to Rebecca. I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Rebecca here to speak to us tonight.
Thank you. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I have to tell you, it's a lot more pleasant in here than it is outside. 35 degrees, my goodness. That said, I do like the warmth, so we can't complain. Before I actually go into talking about management competencies and particularly empowering and delegating, which is really central to that, I want to just talk to you a little bit about my journey, and I like to call it my journey in pictures. I have been incredibly lucky to work with some incredible teams of people and in incredible businesses. And I don't underestimate how privileged I've been to do that. I started my career working with McDonald's, and I worked for a gentleman called Charlie Bell, who was an incredible mentor and role model to me. At 30, he was the CEO of McDonald's in Australia, and at 40, he was the global CEO of McDonald's. And I think, suffice to say, we didn't know what we didn't know, so we just got on and did it and achieved some pretty cool things. And that's a theme I'd leave with you, is sometimes just doing it and not thinking about how hard it is really helps. Transformations chose me. My husband was an elite sports person, and he thinks your body's made for the sport and the sport will choose you rather than you choosing the sport, which can be a little bit alarming when you think about it, but Transformations chose me. I had increasingly complex briefs from Pepsi to Lion Nathan, and ultimately as CEO of Maximum and Barbecues Galore and Kraft and Cadbury. My first CEO role was actually at 32 years old, and I turned around Maximum when I was pregnant with my first child, Lincoln, when I was 34. I integrated Cadbury and Kraft foods in the more recent times, and crazily I was doing that when my daughter was 3 months old. I still look at it and think, my God, how did I do it, and how mad I was to take on that brief. So we'll talk a little bit about how I managed through that. Now I sit on boards as a non-executive director, and I have the great joy of also being able to be involved in the academic side, working with people such as yourselves that will be the leaders of tomorrow, and that's what I'm most passionate about investing in. So one of my earliest lessons in life is that there is unbelievable intrinsic link between leaders and cultures and performance. And so for organisations to perform or transform, the leaders themselves have to transform. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. But the nutshell, or the summary, is that very early I realised that the first person that I needed to understand and to manage and to develop was myself. And so as you're looking towards both now, but as you unfold your career or the journey of your career, the thing that I would suggest you do is just always remember that. When you start with yourself and actually understanding yourself, getting feedback and developing yourself, it will always make you far more powerful as a leader and developer of others. And, you know, frankly, they'll probably also like you more because you're a little bit more humble, which is incredibly useful as a leader. So when I decided that I needed to work on myself and that leaders transform organisations by transforming themselves, it became pretty clear to me that I needed a model for great. And that's one of the things that I think is really powerful about what you're doing at university and how you're going to leverage that when you get out of university, is how you frame and code success. So the model for great leadership that I actually happened upon was actually interestingly developed by scholars out of the University of Michigan. And it's called the Leadership Impact Model, and Human Synergistics International is the company that uses that model. Robert Cook, who's a PhD, and Clayton Lafferty, who's also a PhD from the University of Michigan, developed it based on 360-degree feedback on key leaders across the globe. There are essentially three styles, and this will make sense because I'm going to bring it all back to the topic at the moment. There is a constructive style, which is the one that we want to head towards. There is an aggressive defence or a passive defensive style, and there is an aggressive defensive style. So I'm going to talk about the constructive style first. So constructive leaders set challenging but realistic goals for their team. They encourage people, motivate them to establish plans to deliver against those goals and to pursue their plans with enthusiasm. They impact on others in a way that they enjoy their role, they develop themselves professionally, and they approach problems with creativity, with interest, and with integrity. They encourage people to be supportive of other people, and they help people motivate those around them by helping them to grow and develop. They provide others with positive feedback, and they treat people as members of the team. So they're very focused on inclusion of people and encouraging other people to include people. They impact on others in a way that makes them sensitive to the needs of other people and their teammates. They impact in a way that encourages people to treat each other respectively and cooperatively and to work well together. And so if you listen to that, it kind of sounds like a sort of person you'd like to be as a leader and the sort of leader you'd want to be working for. Okay, so that's the constructive leader. The passive defensive leader impacts on others in a way that they withdraw. They avoid the problem. They act in a very subservient and compliant fashion. They act in a way that seeks approval and in ways that make them littler in the presence of the leader. The aggressive defensive leader impacts on others in a way that makes them search for perfection. So work very long hours, punishing outcomes. It's just incredibly hard to compete against their peer group, to try and control others and act forcefully and go after status and power. And then finally, they oppositionally interact. So in other words, these leaders impact on others in a way that they try to find fault in their other team members. So they're the three styles. Without a doubt, the one that's most correlated to high performance and most likely to achieve transformation in organisations is constructive leadership. And I'm going to link it back into the competencies in a minute. Now, the interesting thing about this research, and this is actually all of the surveys that have been completed in Australia, the picture is actually identical for all of the countries I've operated in, including Japan and Korea. The ideal impact, so the impact that people would like to have on others as a leader, is this impact here. So as you can see, a lot of constructive impact there and very little of the aggressive defensive and the passive defensive mode. The actual impact that people have when they get feedback from their team is far more constricted. And so the reality is that partially because of awareness and partially because of there being a gap between intent and behaviour, people aren't impacting constructively and they're not realising their own potential, their own ideal. Does that make sense? Yeah? So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey. So I always call it, a 20-year journey and a lifetime practice. So, so you've just heard that I am a practicing Buddhist, and so I fundamentally believe that anything that's worth doing requires a daily focus and effort. And leadership impact has certainly been one of those areas. Now, this all looks very constructive now, and this is my profile at the beginning and the end of the transformation of Cadbury and Kraft. Unfortunately, mainly because I'm quite a bit older than you guys, I don't have my earlier profiles electronically, but what I can tell you is that I was higher on perfectionism, I was higher on control, I was higher on competitiveness, and I was higher on oppositional. I still was very high on achievement, I was constructive, and I was low on avoidance, okay? But I had more red there. Now that's not unusual, because often when you come out of university and you're starting your career, you're rewarded for standing out and individual achievement, and often the behaviour you exhibit in that doesn't make you as successful as a leader when you're managing people. Because as you progress through your career, it's going to be less and less about you achieving individually, but rather achieving through others. So as you can see, towards the end of the transformation, my profile was more constructive, but it was constructive at the beginning. Now, what's the so what out of that? Had I not been constructive, it would have been far more difficult for me to take my leadership team on a journey to become constructive leadership. But equally, if I hadn't remained constructive through the transformation, it wouldn't have sustained. So the stats are compelling, and you can go onto the site and get all the stats, because I know that that's something that you'll probably be very interested in. But the thing that I would say to you unequivocally is that constructive leaders are future-focused, visionary-oriented leaders. They enhance other people's productivities. This is all borne out statistically. They make people feel empowered, which is obviously a topic for tonight, versus being micromanaged, which is what happens in the red zone. They emphasise long-term effectiveness rather than short-term results. They bring out the best in people, which is about how they act, not just what they deliver. They are relaxed and at ease. The reality is that when you can harness the collective capability of a team, you are far less stressed as a leader, because you're less focused on you doing it all and being overseeing and controlling it all, because you have confidence in your team to do that, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. They are more interested in feedback and development, which is actually, that's where you source your rejuvenation. So one of the things that keeps you rejuvenated as a human being, particularly in business, is growing and learning. They're more likely to be promoted. So if you happen to be interested in your ability to go up the organisation, being constructive is incredibly useful in that regard. And they lead highly engaged, motivated and performing teams. So pretty compelling, right, in terms of why you might want to be one. Now let's talk about how this fits in with empowerment and delegation. And the reason I put empowerment first and delegation second is that giving over a task without creating a setting of empowerment is more likely to land you into the red zone than the blue zone. And the reason it's going to do that is because you're being task focused, not balanced between task and people. Okay, and so if you look at the sort of elements, because I think there's sometimes some misunderstanding about what delegation's about as well. So the first thing that constructive leaders do is they set the scene. They make sense of what the departure point is, and they make sense of what the destination is, and they align people to the view of that. Now, if you think about being empowered, if you don't know where you're starting, and you don't know where you're going to, and you don't have the critical facts along the way, then the likelihood of you being able to succeed to the degree you're capable of is reduced. So this scene setting role as a leader is absolutely critical. They delegate responsibility. Now, the reason I've used the word responsibility rather than task is because when you delegate responsibility, you're clear on what outcomes you want to achieve, but you give the individual the latitude to do it their way. That is far more exciting and it's far more productive, because your way may not be the only way to do it. They agree with others the outcomes and the standards. Now again, this is really critical to delegation. If you delegate responsibility or you delegate a task, but you aren't clear and aligned with the individual about what you want to achieve at the end of it, then you will not succeed and the person will not succeed, so it hasn't been effective delegation. They provide tools, feedback and coaching. A big part of both empowerment and effective delegation is making sure you're doing everything to give the people or the team what they need to survive. And particularly in my experience in transformations, where you're actually asking people to achieve significant outcomes in difficult environments, a focus on clarity and tools and coaching is absolutely critical. But I'd argue that most organisations are in transformation right now, so wherever you find yourself currently or in the future, the same will be true. They encourage others to influence their own destiny and to actually enjoy what they're doing. The reality is that people are no longer sufficiently motivated by money and heading to the partnership line and all of the other things that are involved historically in motivating people as they were 10, 15 years ago. Turning up and enjoying what they do today is quintessentially important for high potential talent. Well, it's always been important, but it's even more important now. So actually creating that environment where people are enjoying themselves is important. And the creativity is also important too, because at the end of the day you can use data, but it's your ability to actually see the intersections in data and the EQ elements of execution that enable you to really land a strategy that creates value. So creativity is really important. They hold people to account, both through the process and at the end of the process. And again, for delegation to be effective, there needs to be the yin and yang of that, the giving of responsibility and the holding to account. They build confidence, agility and courage, both individually and organisationally. And you can think about, like, even at school or in the university environment, there are certain people that have the impact on others that they make them feel that they can do extraordinary things. Well, particularly if you're about to land someone into a situation of significant change and stress, you need to be able to give them realistic hope and courage and confidence. So that's really critical to empowerment. And this is the other really important thing, is that they tap into and align to people's individual and collective purposes. So if you are clear about what you get out of bed in the morning to achieve, why you were put on this planet. So for me, my individual purpose is to connect people to imagine and create a brighter future. So everything I do through my day, whether it's personally or professionally, aligns to that, or I don't do it. Because I know that if I do, I'm either wasting my time or I'm reducing my happiness exponentially. That's not to say I don't have hardship in doing that, because actually doing that's quite hard at times, but alignment to purpose is really critical and it's really an important leadership tool. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a story within a story. I'm going to show you a story about the transformation of Cadbury and Kraft, which I think will give you a flavour of what I've been talking about, but I'm going to give you a story before you hear that. So probably around about 4 months into the integration of Cadbury and Kraft, we were finding things really difficult, and I was finding things really difficult personally. We had found out that once we started to integrate the two businesses, that in fact we had a turnaround on our hands, not just in integration, and we were finding it really difficult to get traction on the integration and turnaround. At the same time, my father was terminally ill. I think I mentioned earlier, a 4-month-old baby. My husband had sold his tech company and was commuting to Sydney because he got this great multiple and we thought it was too good not to do. But when you put all these things together, and my son, who was 5 years old, had really found the transition to Melbourne from Sydney quite challenging. And so at night, and I was thinking, it just shouldn't be this difficult. And I made a decision that night that would change the trajectory of the integration. I decided to invite my 100 top leaders to come together, and I shared with them my story. I told them about how difficult it was doing the rebases of the business when I went back to Chicago and had to tell Irene Rosenfeld, who was the global CEO, that we had issues. I told them about the fact that I felt that it was more difficult than it should be. And I said to them that whilst I understood what we needed to achieve, we were never going to get there unless all the leaders in the room stepped up, acted within the context of leadership, and together we achieved the transformation. And in that act of vulnerability and authenticity, our whole cultural dynamic changed because people felt empowered to lead the way they wanted to lead. And all of a sudden, it shifted from a group of, say, 10 executive team members owning the transformation agenda to the top 100 leaders within Australia and New Zealand owning the transformation agenda. And the rest is history, but I'm going to tell you what the history looked like in just a moment. So my message is this: if you haven't seen Brené Brown's work or read her work, she's on TED.com, and she's also got 3 great books, but the most recent one is Daring Greatly, and it's about vulnerability and the connection between vulnerability and authenticity to leadership. Then I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. So now I'd like to share with you the story.
Back in 2009, talk of a potential acquisition of Cadbury by Kraft Foods was met with fear and hostility. This led to a bitter battle as Kraft attempted to take control and Cadbury defended its independence fiercely. So when Kraft finally acquired Cadbury on February 2nd, 2010, it had a very different meaning for each side in ANZ. For Kraft, it meant a larger company and greater opportunities, where for Cadbury people, there was a strong sense of loss and anxiety about keeping their jobs. Overnight, Kraft Foods became a $1.6 billion company and a top 5 food company in ANZ. This meant that we were now a major player and crucial to our region's financial success. In April, our new leadership settled in and aligned around a united strategy. We placed the right leaders in the right roles, regardless of where they had come from, and demonstrated our commitment to being a values-led company. However, just as we were finding our feet, operational issues began to surface. There was an $18 million supply chain cost gap, extensive commercial underinvestment, and a lack of focus on core brands. This translated into a serious gap in both revenue and profit, and in August, we had to advise our parent in Chicago of the need to rebase the business. While challenging, we were honest about our situation, and leaders discovered that it was okay to tell the truth, that it would not cost them their job. The global business also committed to doing the right thing for ANZ, so we developed a plan to address the gaps and deliver on our promised financial performance. However, in reality, confusion still reigned. Despite a strong individual desire to make a contribution, many people were unsure of their new, bigger roles and accountabilities, and our focused portfolio strategy was taking time to bed down. Critically, the drumbeat of the business had faltered. Each company had managed itself differently, and we were yet to settle into a new way of working. So for some time we doubted ourselves and each other. We doubted whether we could deliver the numbers, whether the business would continue to believe in us, and whether we were on the right track. We were still uncovering systemic problems within the organisation, and we had to again adjust our profit forecast in November. Facing into our fear of failure, we now stared at every last brutal fact and drew up another turnaround plan. We doubled down our focus on building capability and establishing the operational drumbeat of the business. We called out for support from the £50 billion gorilla and the centres of excellence available in our region. In short, we committed to never miss a number again. And in December, we hit our number. We began 2011 with a new optimism, and on February 14th, we finally came together in one head office as one team with one set of numbers, albeit seemingly unrealistic ones. Gradually, we drew confidence from the strong, focused commercial plans we had built, and this, combined with outstanding execution and strategic customer relationships, started to deliver results. Increasingly, we cultivated a culture of hope, not fear, and collectively we committed to do everything we could to deliver our promise. In July, we achieved our challenging half-year targets. The evidence was now mounting that our hard work was paying off. Our supply chain had dramatically improved costs and service. The new category model was providing the focus we needed. Our work on leadership transformation was gaining momentum, and the extended leadership structures such as the EELT and the Senior Leaders Forum were building empowerment and accountability. By year end, we achieved our ambitious financial targets, growing at twice the rate of retail. We grew share in 4 out of 5 categories, secured a 50% share of chocolate, lifted our customer service by 20%, and reduced safety incidents by 40%. We have achieved so much and are now Australia's fastest growing food manufacturer, but realise the journey is far from over.
So that's all I have to say right now. But obviously, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. You've covered off a number of different areas that we've touched on. I thought maybe before we go to questions, you spoke a bit about feedback and 360 feedback, and the students have been doing a lot of work in that area. Could you tell us about how, in your senior positions, how you gathered feedback from others and what you did with that feedback?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first thing about feedback is that the earlier you start it and the more you do it, the more comfortable you are and the more comfortable others are giving you feedback. So we used formal tools. So, and particularly I think at the beginning of when I go in and do transformations at the beginning, I tend to use anonymous formal tools because people feel more comfortable because they don't know you well enough to know if that feedback is going to be received and treated with respect and gratitude. And so I think the first thing is giving people security around how they give the feedback. Then symbolically, it is really important what you do with that feedback once you have it. So what I used to do and still do when I get feedback is that I share that feedback in its totality with my team. And so the transformation story of Australia and New Zealand was written by 3,600 team members. And from the beginning, we shared strategy, we shared my feedback, we shared our progress in a very transparent fashion. And we did that, A, because we fundamentally believed that every person deserved to know that and we respected their contribution and felt that that was important. But also, if you're going to ask trust of others, you need to show trust to them first of all. So providing them with access to the feedback is really important. And then the third thing that's really important is demonstrating commitment to doing something about it. Because if people give you feedback and they've been courageous enough, particularly if it's something they feel you should improve, if they don't see you A, acknowledge it without being defensive or aggressive in any way, or B, act on it, even if you falter, even if you get it wrong, as long as they can see you're making an effort to actually change these things, then you will find that it opens the floodgates and all of a sudden people will give you very sort of in the moment feedback. And so now I get pretty much constant feedback, as I do from my children, you know, because my children know that patience is my thing I'm working on, which is really good as Buddhist, isn't it? And so my daughter every now and then will come and say, "Mummy, not having a good day today? Patience a bit difficult?" 6 years old, little Zen master that she is. She is also a lot more patient than me. You know, so I think that it's really important. And when you realise that people give you feedback because they really want you to be better, then all of a sudden you don't feel bad that you're not perfect. And you know what? This This is the truth. None of us are. But there's this crazy thing in our culture, which is just getting worse and worse every year, where we feel ashamed if we're not perfect. And that's just diabolical, because we're never going to be perfect. And so the reason that perfect is in the red and achievement is in the blue is achievement is about knowing what's important and doing a good job or your best possible job against it. Perfection is trying to be perfect at everything. And that's why people that try and be perfect are stressed out, work incredibly long hours, or practice incredible long hours, whatever it is. And the best thing that ever happened to me was me coming to terms with my own perfectionism. And you know what, it wasn't just good for me, it was really good for my team.
Hi, Rebecca. I'd like to know what will you do if you found you empower the wrong person to do the wrong thing? Thank you.
Well, see, my personal perspective is that you never do the wrong thing empowering someone. You just may find that people have got limitations that you didn't anticipate. So my truth or belief is that 99.99% of people get out of bed in the morning wanting to do a really good job. And so when you empower them or give them responsibility for something, then part of the art is actually understanding what their skill level and competence level is in the first place, so that you give them a responsibility that is actually aligned to their skill, because otherwise you're setting them up for failure. But the other thing that's really important is doing the checking in, so that if they are floundering a little bit or finding it more difficult, then you can give the tools and support and maybe even correct the size of the responsibility to line up to their point of development at that point in time. I've had people mess up. They've generally learnt more out of that experience than they have out of any other experience, and some of those people are now the people I'm most proud of in terms of what they've achieved personally and how they've achieved it. Because generally when you have, and I've certainly had mistakes in my career, when you've experienced that, your level of empathy for others and your level of commitment to support others to make sure that they're set up for success is even greater. And so there's only been probably a couple of times where I've delegated and empowered someone and found out subsequent to the event that they didn't really want to do the job. But actually, if I hadn't done that, then we wouldn't have been having the conversation that ultimately allowed them to choose something they really did want to do. Because sometimes people are doing jobs that they are not suited to and don't want to do, and it's not until there's a aha moment that they realise that, and then that gives you an opportunity to help them, work out what it is they want to do. So, you've got to be ready. If you're going to be a constructive leader, an empowering leader, you've got to be ready for the fact that people will make mistakes, because that's how they learn. And you've got to be ready to pick them up when they do. And it's the repeated mistakes that you need to watch out for. If people repeat the same mistake over, then there's probably an issue around their learning capability, which you might have to deal with separately. Does that answer your question? Yeah? You're welcome.
Just regarding about the question, what you're saying, being honest and empowering employees.
Yes.
How do you manage expectations from the corporate head centers and your employees? Because there's always bound to be differences, a disconnect with reality, and different expectations to certain issues. Okay. So, how do you manage that?
Yeah, look, the great thing about, if you create a constructive culture and it's an open culture where there's a lot of feedback and dialogue, then often you can have conversations with people that no one's ever had with them before. And so I think that often the disconnect between people, so I presume you're talking, people think that they can do a task that's really complex when maybe they've got the skills that aren't quite as developed as that. Is that what you're thinking about?
More on the line of objectives. Corporatism have different objectives than the people who...
Oh, okay. In terms of, the alignment factor of what the corporate wants versus the individual. Look, again, I think part of that is, because transformation is all about alignment, but I think often what we do is, because we don't create the setting for people, then we don't give them the opportunity to align their expectations with what the corporation's wanting to achieve. So people come in thinking they're doing the right thing by the organisation, but because they don't understand the vision or the strategy or the corporate goals or even their own performance sort of KPIs and success factors, then they do really hard work doing what they think they should be doing. So for me, that fits into the sort of feedback and development loop that goes along with delegation and empowering, because if you can communicate what you're trying to achieve and align people at the very beginning and set goals and objectives and plans that fit in with that, then generally speaking, people will give their best effort to actually align to that. Now, there will be times when the head office has targets that they've actually committed to the street, okay, because that's often where it all gets a bit wobbly. They've committed to the street, which is actually important in terms of keeping the share price where it needs to be, that at the operational level look as though it's completely unrealistic. And often that's because they're actually asking for a lot of growth, but they're not actually giving the resources to deliver the growth. The job of a leader is to have the courage to communicate up bad news. And so we used to call it managerial courage, which was actually one of our key competencies for our senior leaders. And that's the ability to have the conversation like I had with Irene, which is, I know that you thought you bought this, but what you bought is this, and therefore we have to do a turnaround before we're going to get this business to be a high growth business. Now, that is really hard to do, but if you don't do it, you set your team up for failure, because you're saying yes to targets that you know you can never achieve, and then people keep on trying and trying and trying, and everyone feels like they're failing. And once people feel like they're failing, fear increases, and it's a downward spiral from there. So yeah, it's really important. Managerial courage is the key thing there. Yeah. Good question though. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you all. I hope I haven't completely confused you, but good luck. You know, you're at such an exciting point of your career journey, and the great thing about it is the world is changing so fast, and there's so many paradoxes and challenges out there that the magic source is leadership. And so the fact that you're sitting in here and understanding that to complement all the other technical skills you need to have, because strategy and marketing, all those sort of things are really important as well, but leadership and being able to impact constructively and create a culture of performance will be the thing that will ensure your success and most critically your team's success. So good luck with it all. Enjoy.